Hello, good morning to everybody. Welcome to join my today's talk about the international house market in the midst of pandemic. So I'm now under lockdown, and that's the reason why I have to prepare this pre-recorded video at home. So I hope very soon we can meet in person and then to discuss with you in more detail. So I have prepared this PowerPoint to talk to all of you about this very important topic to understand about the international housing market in the midst of the COVID pandemic. This pre-recorded video is made at home during the lockdown and the pandemic provides us a unique opportunity to study what causes house price change in the first few months after the outbreak of COVID. Right? It is very interesting to note that the world plunged into a deep recessionary period. Unemployment rate skyrocketed. Businesses were closed. However, interestingly, house prices in the world did not fall, but went up strongly and globally. So that's the reason why, right? It works like an experiment for us to understand the determinants of house price change. So this is the reason why I prepare this PowerPoint and to discuss with all of you about this very unique opportunity for us to study about the cause of house price boom in the midst of the pandemic. But before that, let me introduce myself first. I'm Edward Yiu, Associate Professor of the University of Auckland Business School, New Zealand, and welcome of you to my university. And here shows my office building and my team in the Department of Property. So welcome all of you. University of Auckland is one of the largest and the oldest university in New Zealand, hosting over 40,000 students in the 5 Auckland campuses. And it is a very old university. It's now 138 years old, as it was opened since 1883. And here shows the clock tower, an iconic building of our university. And I'm looking forward to receiving all of you in person in Auckland next time. So let's start. House prices usually goes hand in hand with the economy. When the gross domestic product, the GDP, is increasing, house price will almost always go down. Similarly, during a recession, that is when GDP goes down continuously, house prices will also go down. However, this time, with the COVID pandemic, the world is not the same. Why? After the outbreak of the pandemic, in early 2020, the world's economy plummeted into a deep recession. The map here shows how serious and widespread the recession was. Almost the whole world was in dark red, indicating that there was a global recession, and the chart also shows the depth of the recession at about -4 to -6%. And it does not only happen in developed countries, but also in developing and emerging countries. I extract these 5 economies to show the synchronized plummet of their GDP growth rates. Here shows Australia, AUS, Canada, CAN, New Zealand, NZL, the United Kingdom, UK, and the United States of America, USA. So all of their GDP annual growth rates turned south into negative zones continuously for at least 2 quarters. So it is technically divided as a recession for all these economies in 2020. So that is the reason why I call that is a global recession in 2020, and which is directly linked to the COVID pandemic. New Zealand in particular, here the time series chart shows that in 2020, New Zealand was in the deepest recession throughout the record. The GDP growth rate here shows was negative 11.4%, which is unprecedented. But interestingly, even though we have the pandemic, we had a global recession, very grim prospects of the economy, but we had a global house price boom. And here the Financial Times provide a very interesting chart. During such a period of a global recession together with the long-lasting pandemic, house prices in most parts of the world did not go down, but rebound strongly. Here the chart shows the red line, right? The proportions of countries recording an increase in house prices. And in 2021, more than 90% of all countries in the world are now experiencing a house price boom. No wonder the Financial Times editor make the headline that the pandemic drives a global house price boom. So how can we explain such a phenomenon? A global house price boom during a global recession under the pandemic. So again, I focus on these 6 economies. They are Australia, Canada, I add Hong Kong here, New Zealand, UK, and also US. And in Q3 of 2020, all of them got a positive increase in house price. New Zealand in particular got a 15.4% increase, while UK and US got 7.6% and 8.4%, while Australia and Canada got a 4.5% and 3.9%, and only Hong Kong got a trivial 0.82% increase. So what causes these strong increases in house prices in these economies? So I emphasize the keyword synchronized because it is the uniqueness of this phenomena. Right? In the past, it can be difficult to tell what caused the house price boom. But in this particular experimental-like pandemic, because we found a synchronized house price rebound. I mean, they went up almost at the same time. Then there must be a trigger. The house price increases are highly synchronized. This is the most important point here. Immediately after the outbreak of the pandemic, all of them show a rebound of their house prices, and the growth are still continuing up to the moment when I prepare this presentation PowerPoint. There must be a common trigger that caused such a synchronized house price boom. And it is impossible to attribute a globalized and synchronized phenomenon by different local issues in different countries or economies. There must be a common reason to cause a synchronized and globalized house price boom. Here I refer to the IMF, the International Monetary Fund report. They chart the growth rate of house prices of 60 countries included in their IMF Global House Price Index. Here shows that more than 90% of the 60 countries are having a boom in their housing market. The first 3 are Luxembourg, Turkey, and New Zealand. They rank the top 3 with their growth rate in 2020 more than 13%. So let's take a look about New Zealand in particular, because here shows a very interesting story behind. So here shows the time series and its growth rate. It clearly associated with the pandemic, as here shows you the house price index of New Zealand, the red line. Okay, and also the year-on-year change, the blue shade. Before 2020, indeed there was a minor drop in house price, probably due to the enactment of the Overseas Investment Amendment Act, which I will go into more details in the coming slides. But then after this minor drop in house price, then immediately after the outbreak of the pandemic, then the house price index rebounds strongly and the house price skyrocket. So it framed the key questions today. It becomes an unanswered question when we are facing this deadly COVID pandemic. It has already killed 5 million people and has been causing huge economic losses, and it has resulted in a global recessionary period with unprecedented suspension of businesses, lockdowns of cities, and a large number of people are unemployed. People are anxious and find their future uncertain. But then, how come? Why people would go to borrow money from banks to buy houses? It is a long-term investment, and are they expecting a prosperous future? What causes the global house price boom in 2020 then? So I put forward here the common 5 hypotheses. These are possible explanations, and they are the 5 major possible explanations for house price booms. They are: number 1, economic growth; number 2, insufficient housing supply; number 3, migrants; number 4, capital tax; and number 5, monetary policy. Monetary policy includes interest rate and mortgage policy. So I'm going to explore these 5 hypotheses one by one in the coming slide, and this pandemic provides us a unique experimental-like opportunity to test these hypotheses, and now we finally have a consensus on the course. So the first hypothesis: it is commonly recognized that house price growth is associated with economic growth. Right? The logic is simple and straightforward. When people are rich, then they will be more affordable to buy houses. But interestingly, there have been some studies showing the reverse. It's not economic growth that causes house price increase, but the reverse. It is house price change that make significant effect on economic growth. And here, for example, I cite Miller, Penn, and Schuyler's 2011 paper confirming the association and the direction of the causation. It is what we call the wealth effect. But today, I'm not going into details about this technical term, but at least some scholars have already refuted this hypothesis based on the direction of causation. Okay, but then make it more interesting and easier to understand. Here I use New Zealand as an example again. Using New Zealand as an example, right, the chart here shows vividly that the current house price boom cannot be explained by economic growth. The chart shows a strong and positive association between house price changes and GDP changes, no matter which one is the cause, which one is the effect. However, this time, it is absolutely an outlier, right, to the past pattern. So this time we have a negative GDP growth rate, but still a positive house price change. So it refutes the economic growth hypothesis completely. Then let's go into hypothesis 2. The second hypothesis is also commonly accepted as the truth. Whenever house prices go up, then it is always said to be caused by insufficient housing supply, yet they usually could not provide evidence. So this time, the pandemic provide a good chance to test this hypothesis. First of all, it is illogical to use insufficient supply as an explanation for an international phenomenon, right? Because insufficient housing supply is a local issue. It doesn't make sense to use a local issue to explain a synchronized global issue, a global phenomenon, as it is very unlikely to have a globalized insufficiency in housing supply suddenly within a few months after the outbreak of the pandemic. In fact, there are many countries reported to have very high vacancy rates before the crisis. So it cannot be explained by insufficient housing supply. So this chart I cite from the OECD report about the percentage of vacant dwellings out of the total dwellings stock in 2020 in the OECD countries. So you will find that, say, for example, the US, Canada, New Zealand, etc., are all encountering very high vacancy rates. US and Australia in particular, they have more than or close to 10% dwellings that are vacant. So it is not reasonable to say that house price boom is caused by insufficient supply. In New Zealand, indeed, we are having a record high housing supply. So here the chart shows you that since 2020, the number of new homes consented has been increasing rapidly and has broken the record since 1938. So we have more house than enough. And here another chart also confirmed the evidence. Since 2006, you will find that the rate of increase in the number of new private dwellings, that's the private housing supply, has been continuously more than the rate of increase in the number of new households in New Zealand. And then in Auckland, in particular, you will find that in the past 2 years, there are surpluses in housing supply. That is the number of new dwellings completed. New dwellings completed are more than the sum of lateral increase in population, net internal migration, and net international migration. So in other words, right, we have more houses than demand. So it does not make good sense to attribute the recent house price booms to insufficient housing supply. Okay, then for hypothesis 3 is about migrant effect. Let's see, would it be caused by newcomers who make house price unaffordable? So of course, there have been various studies supporting this argument. For example, here I showed Moran 2011 articles, which extracting the study in 2007, right, showing the chart, the association between house price changes and net migration. This article tried to conclude that migration policy linked to inflated housing prices. So this argument or hypothesis has convinced many politicians in New Zealand on the causes of unaffordable housing prices. So the question is, does it apply in the recent housing price boom? The answer is no, because due to all the previous studies arguing that it was migrant effect causing house price increase. So that's why since October 2018, and a new law was enacted. The name of the law is called the Overseas Investment Amendment Act, which banned non-residents or non-citizens home buyers in New Zealand, right, from buying houses. So since 2018, October, no more home buyings by non-residents or non-citizens in New Zealand. So in 2020, the house price boom cannot be caused by migrants. And here shows you the evidence. Indeed, it is reported by the Statistical Department of New Zealand government. And here the two lines shows the home transfer from non-citizens or non-residents, buyers and sellers. So you will find that after the enactment of the Overseas Investment Amendment Act in late 2018, then the number of home transfers by non-citizens or non-residents buyers plummet sharply to almost a trivial figure. But the sellers, the non-citizens or non-resident sellers, keeps on selling. So in other words, after the enactment of the new laws, there have been very, very few non-residents, non-citizens buyers in New Zealand market. Okay. Yep. Then let's go into hypothesis 4. Would that be because of the capital gain tax? Because many people, right, would say that it is because of the taxation that determines whether investors and speculators would invest in housing markets. But even if it is true, it could not explain the recent synchronized house price boom, because there was no synchronized change in capital gain tax in the world after the outbreak of the pandemic, right? So temporarily, the two does not match. Furthermore, the capital gain tax policies in different countries or economies are very different. For example, here I just picked 3. There is no capital gain tax in Hong Kong, but there's a bright line tax in New Zealand and a 20% capital gain tax in the UK, right? These 3 economies have very different capital gain tax policy, but they all experience a house price boom after the outbreak of the pandemic. That is a synchronized house price boom. Then how come can 3 different capital gain tax policy without any change after the outbreak, but got the synchronized house price boom? I refer to the bright line test in New Zealand. Here I showed you that it is about those investors who resell the houses within a certain short period of time will be taxed. So say, for example, during the pandemic, I refer to this period from 2018 to 2021, right? The bright line test applied to it was a 5-year taxable period. So in other words, it will only tax those investors they resell their houses within 5 years' time, would incur a capital gain tax. And it was increased from a 2-year period to a 5-year period. So indeed, it set a stricter restriction. So you could not explain why it can trigger a global house price boom. Okay, then the last hypothesis, which is monetary policy. So, of course, monetary policy refers to interest rate, mortgage policy, money supply policy, but here I focus more on the real interest rate issue. On the one hand, because there was a synchronized interest rate cut after the outbreak of the pandemic, and secondly, it provides a measurable metric for us to conduct an empirical test. So the diagram here shows the global interest rate cut in 2020. This is a very important information for us to understand about why there was a global house price boom during the midst of a pandemic. Okay, this is the only factor that shows a synchronized change globally after the outbreak. There were 2007 interest rate cuts by central banks in 2020. Most of them happened in the first quarter of 2020, when 54 central banks tried to support the economies by cutting interest rate 73 times. Some were even to historic lows. So here shows the extent of the interest rate cut in some of the major economies. The US, say for example, has a very substantial cut by 150 base points. And the chart shows a sharp cut of the interest rate by the Fed after the outbreak in 2020. And it is also the first time in history that the Fed rate was cut to zero. Okay, so it's very substantial, very sharp, abrupt cut in interest rate. And it does not only happen in the US, but it happens across the whole world. And here I showed you the 5 countries, again, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, UK, and US. You will find that before the cut, all of them stood on a high interest rate. And then after the cut, right, all of them dropped substantially. And the UK, right, cut the interest rate twice in just 2 quarters' time. So a recent article by the Financial Times here showed you that they agree that it is the record low interest rate that had boosted house price at an unusually fast pace during a period of weak economic activity. And it shows a chart here about the general downturn of mortgage rates from year 2007 to 2020. And the top 2 are New Zealand and Australia. And it explains probably why New Zealand's house price boom is the strongest one. And then another article by IMF. And here shows you the IMF research indicated that low interest rates contribute to the boom in house prices. They sample 60 countries' house price from the IMF Global House Price Index, and more than 90% of them are having an increase in house prices. Referring to the recent 2 meetings of the Federal Reserve of the US, some of their members also agreed that low interest rates were contributing to elevated house prices. So it's not just our guess or just our academic thought. It is now agreed from scholars, from scientific evidence, from central bankers, and also from reporters. So it has now become a consensus that global property prices have increased steeply for more than a decade, which is fueled by record low interest rates. So let me also make use of the New Zealand as an example. So the interest rate cut by the Reserve Bank of the New Zealand in Q1 of 2020 is a good example. And here shows you the OCR, right? The interest rate was cut by 75 base points. But then the effect was immediately transferred to the mortgage rate offered by the banks. And the effect are magnified from 75 base point to 125 base point, right? So the government cut 75 points, but the bankers magnified the effect to 125 points in mortgage rate. So you attract more investors and speculators to borrow cheap money and to make a big profit from the market. And worse still, besides cutting interest rate, indeed, the Reserve Bank of New Zealand also relaxed the mortgage loan restriction. That's the loan to value ratio restriction in April 2020. So that's the monetary policy does not only limit to interest rate cut, but it also applies to money supply policy and mortgage policy. And here shows a very good example to explain why New Zealand's housing price will get such a huge, sharp increase after the outbreak of the pandemic, right? Because relaxing the loan to value ratio restrictions, which allow investors and home occupiers to borrow much higher loan to value ratio than before. And indeed, it is now admitted by the central bankers of New Zealand Reserve Bank that this is one of the major causes of the house price hike. And so the mortgage loan restriction has been reinstated after 1 year, that is since March 2021. So now we can summarize our findings. Now we understand that, right? A clear picture about why with such a deadly pandemic, which results in a global recession, a lot of unemployment, a lot of city lockdowns, and people are uncertain and anxious, but still we get a house price boom. It is because many central bankers, they work together in a concerted effort to cut their interest rate to unprecedented low so as to support the economy, to avoid recessions and deflation. And then because of that, money supply increased, investors and speculators find it cheap to borrow, and they would like to hedge inflation. And that's why then they buy more houses. And because of that, then it creates inflation. It now, the whole world is encountering a global inflation. Too much money chasing too few goods, so it results in a global inflation. And because of inflation, then asset investments is a good vehicle to hedge inflation. And so we are expecting a price increase. It explained well, right, why a sudden flooding of money supply into the capital market, which trigger a synchronized boom of house prices in the world. Okay, so inflation here shows you that after the outbreak of the pandemic, then many countries start to get their inflation rate increase. Some of them even turn from negative to positive zone. So, of course, nowadays, we all agree that we are having a serious inflation regime in the whole world. And here the two charts show you that at the time of the pandemic, we got deflation, and then after the interest rate cut, now we turn sharply back to a serious inflation. And the trend agree with the trend in money supply. So a global inflation can be evidenced by this chart and the map. And here shows you that a globalized inflation pattern and the inflation rate in the US have already breaks the 30 years record and surpassed 6% now. The inflation rates of many developed economies exceed the 2% threshold in 2021. So it becomes a very clear casual observation now when nominal interest rate was cut to unprecedented lows, then inflation rate break the record high. The real interest rate becomes much more negative, assumed in this diagram. All economists except one got negative real interest rate. And then, right, because of the negative real interest rate, then investors and speculators, right, can borrow money easily and to hedge inflation, so they invest in housing market. And that's why then house price increased substantially, which confirmed the negative association between real interest rate and house price change. So let me demonstrate some of my empirical tests on this association between real interest rate hypothesis, right, on the 6 economies, and see whether empirically the result would support the hypothesis or not. So I use the International House Price Index from the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas because it provides a uniform definition and attributes of house prices for different countries, and which make house price more comparable. And also their house price index in real terms, so it excludes different inflations in different countries. Okay, here shows the result. So make it very simple. The results show a significant and negative effect of real interest rate, RIR here, right? No matter it's a year-on-year model or a quarter-on-quarter model, both of them showed a negative and significant effect of the real interest rate on real house price index change. Okay, we have already controlled the fixed effect of the cross-economy factors. And then, right here also showed you the study on New Zealand in particular. It also shows a negative and significant effect of real interest rate on house price change. And the diagram, the scatter plot, right, also show a very clear downward sloping relationship between real interest rate and house prices. So let me conclude. Here I would like to use the two scholars' statement to conclude our finding. The first one by Steve Keen. He said, why we can't afford to buy a home is not because of too little land, but it's because of too much bank lending. And then George Ryan Collins called it a housing finance feedback cycle. That is, unlimited credit and money flows into an inherently finite supply of money, right? So too much money chasing too little goods. So it causes rising housing price. The pandemic tried to prove the hypothesis. So these are the conclusions. We take the COVID pandemic as a unique opportunity to do a cross-country quasi-experiment to test the determinants of house prices. Since the house price boom 2020 is a global phenomenon, it is likely to be caused by a common globalized, synchronized trigger rather than a local issue. And there's only one synchronized effort of cutting interest rate by most of the central banks after the outbreak of the pandemic. And also the cross-country panel analysis confirmed empirically the negative association between real interest rates and house price rises. And lastly, theoretically, a negative real interest rate makes financial costs lower and it makes buying cheaper than renting, right? Buying a home can even be cheaper than renting a home. So it attracts investors to join the bandwagons. That's the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention. For more details of the study, you can read my recent published paper in Urban Science. I provide a link here. It is open access. You can download it, read it at your leisure time. And if you have any further discussions, please feel free to find my contacts at my homepage. That's all for today. Thank you very much. Hope to see you soon and take care. Bye-bye.